This is a conversation with Soner Cagaptay, a director of the Turkish Research Program at the Washington Institute and a leading expert on Turkish foreign policy. Turkey is increasingly influential, but at the same time, few people outside of it actually understand its ambitions, strategy, or how it sees its place in the world. And so in this conversation, we try to uncover that. We talk about why Turkey is both a friend and an enemy of Russia, whether it's trying to rebuild the Ottoman Empire, what is the actual level of threat from Turkey to Greece, why is Israel preparing for war with Turkey, why is Turkey actually in NATO, and much, much more. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And this podcast is also supported by generous supporters on Patreon that you can join to help ensure its continued existence and get access to full-length ad-free episodes and a bunch of other perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for hosting me, Dominique.
So we're going to be talking about the Turkish foreign policy. And the way I see it, Turkey has been in recent years increasingly both influential and active beyond its borders. But at the same time, it seems to me that to most people outside of Turkey, including myself, it's quite unclear sort of the fundamentals of the Turkish foreign policy. How does Turkey see itself and its role in the world? What is it after? What kind of ambitions it has? So could we start there with sort of kind of a high-level overview of how does Turkey see itself and its role? What are its ambitions and what is it trying to do?
Absolutely. I would say that Turkish foreign policy has entered quite a unique era considering historic trends stretching back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire more than 100 years ago. The historic trend line meaning that Turkey kind of, for about 100 years following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, saw itself as European, had an overtly European vocation, and kind of ignored most other parts of the world. That is no more the case. In the last 2 decades, following trial and some error and failures in other areas, Erdogan has finally kind of recast Turkey as the country that is rooted in Anatolia, a transcontinental space, a country that is no more primarily preoccupied with Europe, a country that sees itself as European, but also as Middle Eastern, as Eurasian. In fact, a country that is in love with no region of the world, but just with itself. And that is quite different if you look at Turkish foreign policy, starting with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire until pretty much this decade, where there was a singular preoccupation with Europe. There's many reasons that informed this process, one of which was that founders of modern Turkey, including Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, were born in Europe, in the European parts of the Ottoman Empire. And Ataturk and others, elites, but also millions of Ottoman Muslims and Turks were expelled from Europe during the collapse of the empire. They ended up in Anatolia. For about a century, these elites almost wanted to go back to Europe. Because that's where they came from. That's where their families are from. And so for them, Turkey's Europeanness was a return to Europe, not entry into Europe. And so I would say elites were, both politically and passionately attached to Europe. That is gone. Erdogan represents a new generation of elites who are Anatolian-born and Anatolian-rooted. Those elites have replaced Turkey's European-rooted and sourced elites. And it's natural that these Anatolian-born elites, don't have this kind of political, let's say, identification deep-rooted with Europe as the Kemalist elites did. And instead, they have this Anatolian identity. And so minus the political preoccupation with Europe, therefore, the new Turkey now sees itself as rooted in this transcontinental space. And it basically says, I live here, and I will deal with all regions around me. That's Europe, that's Middle East, that's Eurasia. So you could say Turkey went from having this really binary identity, exclusively European, to one that is completely non-binary It's part European, part Eurasian, part Middle Eastern, and perhaps it's none of these things because it deals with these identities in a rather transactional way, and it says, I just belong to this area that sits at the crossroad of these three regions. So I think that's a pretty significant shift. And I think it informs a lot of Turkey's decisions, including its transactionalism, its ties with Russia, its policies on Ukraine war, and its ties with the US, and of course with the EU and NATO going forward.
I want to be talking about all those topics that you've mentioned, but maybe before that, I guess that basically, to some extent, Turkish foreign policy is also Erdogan's foreign policy, since he's been in power in Turkey for quite a long time, and he's been shaping this foreign policy. So, will it? To what extent is it tied to him, and to what extent it's broader than him?
I think that Erdogan informs this new trend, but he's also its main protagonist, but he hasn't created it. In other words, this is not a conscious political choice where Erdogan doesn't like Europe or likes the Middle East. It is basically a choice informed by the transformation of the elites, where earlier the elites were politically attached to Europe because that's where many of the elites directly came from, or sometimes they had parents and grandparents born in Europe during the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but expelled from Europe, from countries as far as Bosnia and Hungary into what is now Turkey. And these elites really had a hold on how Turkey viewed the world. Turkey kind of singularly identified with Europe. I remember I grew up in Turkey, that in the late 20th century, when Turkish news, TV news would be broadcasting, whether they would show a map of Europe, Turkey will not be at the center of it. Turkey will be at the bottom right-hand corner, and they would show it with the map centered on Switzerland and ignoring Turkey's southern and eastern neighbors and saying this is the only area that matters. That map is now gone. When you see weather forecast maps of Turkey, Turkey's at the center, and you see countries up to Central Europe, countries up to Persian Gulf, countries up to the Caspian Sea, and countries up to North Africa. So maybe Turkey has re-centered itself, and not just the elites have shifted, but the demographic center of gravity of the country has also shifted. The population that comes from Europe, expelled from the Balkans into Europe during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1920s. At the time, Ataturk fashioned Turkey as a secular, Europe-facing country. That population constituted about half of Turkey's population. Now, because of demographic shifts, it's probably down to 20%. And so you have really the center of gravity of the demographics has shifted to Anatolian-born citizens. So not just elites have shifted, but the citizens who support these elites have also shifted in demographics. And so for me, Erdogan is the main actor of this trend, but he's not its inventor, because the trend is informed by demographic, political, and vocational shifts. Vocational meaning Turkey no more sees Europe as its singular vocation internationally. It sees Europe as a partner, but not where it has to belong at whatever cost. So I would say Erdogan maybe symbolizes the shift, but he's by no means created it. In fact, he's a product of it more than being a driver of it.
A claim that I've sometimes heard about Turkish foreign policy is that its ambition can be summarized as trying to rebuild the Ottoman Empire. Would you say that this is accurate or true description of its ambitions? And if so, what does that actually mean? In what way would be Turkey trying to do that?
I hear this word neo-Ottomanism thrown around quite a bit. I think that it's impossible for modern Turkey to be neo-Ottomanist, this because of Ataturk's reforms. Understanding modern Turkey, including Erdogan, some of whose policies are a reaction to Ataturk, goes through understanding reforms of Ataturk. As the Ottoman Empire fell apart and Ataturk liberated Turkey from Allied occupation at the end of World War I, he then went ahead and crafted Turkey as a purely European, Europe-facing secular society. He implemented a number of dramatic reforms, which I think are kind of revolutionary. These include changing of the alphabet, changing of the script, including that, of course, changing of the calendar. Very significant because they created an epistemological break with the Ottoman past. So Turkish is now written in Latin alphabet. That means 99% of Turkey's citizens cannot read letters written to them by their great-grandparents, if this was written in Ottoman script using Arabic. And 99% of Turkey's citizens have no idea when they enter the Ottoman Topkapı Palace in Istanbul what the inscription says at the portal to the palace. So when you talk about Neo-Ottomanism, I think the reforms of Ataturk produce a complete break with the Ottoman past in terms of epistemological and kind of conscious connections. So I describe Ataturk's reforms as saying that he Control Alt Delete reformatted Turkey. You know, when your computer gets stuck, you reboot it, you press Control Alt Delete. That's what Ataturk did for Turkey. He deleted the old software, he loaded new software, and everything has been built on top of new software. So I think when Turks think of Ottoman past, it's more of a romanticized, not a realistic idea of what the Ottomans were. And Erdogan, of course, speaks to that narrative. I think that nations that were great powers once have an inflated sense of their heyday. And this comes with a propensity to be inspired by leaders who embody and speak to this narrative of the heyday. And this is exactly Erdogan. He is, in my view, together with Hungarian Prime Minister Orban, among the early inventors of make your country great again politics in this century. It's a model that has been copied by leaders elsewhere. So Erdogan speaks to a narrative of imperial greatness. It's not quite a connection to the Ottomans, but it's a romanticized connection to the Ottomans. Erdogan is saying this country was a great power once. It did not have to play a small country a role under the EU or NATO. It can be a powerful nation. And to some extent, he has delivered that. Turkey has built a really impressive defense industry, including drones, and as well as having its military has made an amazing comeback from the failed coup attempt in 2016. Turkey has since won, or Turkey and its allies rather, have won wars against Russia and its allies in Syria, most recently in Libya and South Caucasus. Turkey also leverages its position in NATO in its relationship with the United States. For example, recently getting F-16 fighter planes in return for allowing Sweden to join NATO. So I think as a sort of a post-imperial nation, Turkey wants to be considered and respected as a middle power, maybe a swing state. And what makes it really consequential for the United States, where I'm based, and also for Turkey's NATO allies, since Turkey is a NATO member, is that there are many swing states or states that want to be seen as middle powers today: India, Brazil, South Africa. But Turkey is the only swing state and middle power that's also a NATO member. So it makes it quite consequential and unique in even considering the class of swing states around.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. I want to talk about that, but maybe since we already started talking about the post-imperial and the Ottoman connection, maybe a good place to start would be the Middle East and Turkish foreign policy in the Middle East. Because back in the Ottoman Empire, Turkey was the dominant power, or at least a very significant power in the region. Do you think that when it comes to the Middle East, Turkey has maybe an ambition to kind of get to that position again? Or what would be its rough, if not that, what is its foreign policy in the Middle East?
Yeah. So when we started this conversation, I said we are seeing a dramatic shift in Turkey's global identity. It's going from one that's singularly occupied with Europe to one that is occupied or in love with itself and with no other region, unlike in the past where the Turkey of Ataturk was basically in love with Europe. That's no more the case. But before we got to this point where Turkey's in love with no region but itself, Erdogan actually tried to make Turkey opposite of Ataturk's Turkey, singularly preoccupied with the Middle East. For about a 10-year period, Turkey's foreign policy under Erdogan has gone through a number of pivots. In the first decade, he was an internationalist from 2003 when he became prime minister, roughly for about a 10-year period. He hoped that pursuing EU accession talks, which brought a lot of foreign direct investment to Turkey and helped him win elections, He hoped that this process would also kind of anchor Turkey in Europe. It didn't happen. There were a lot of objections to Turkey's EU accession from large EU countries, France and Germany, and also democratic transgressions at home. It takes two to tango meant that EU accession process was blocked. At the time of Arab uprisings, as Turkey's EU accession process seemed to be going nowhere, and with Turkey doing so well economically, which is also a factor that's helping Erdogan win elections, Erdogan decided to pivot Turkey's foreign policy and make Turkey a star power nation in the Middle East. His belief was that Turkey would become a leader nation in the Middle East, and that would pivot Turkey to become a leader nation among Muslims beyond the Middle East. It didn't quite turn out like that. In fact, the opposite happened. Turkey ended up not only not having any allies in the Middle East, but also losing its friends and allies. That was because of Turkey's singular support to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a political party during Arab uprisings. If you're a practitioner of foreign policy and if you interfere in other countries' affairs, you know that you never put your money behind one candidate or one political movement, because if that candidate loses, you lose everything. So at the time, Turkey should have diversified and supported different actors in the Arab uprisings, but that was not the case. Turkey singularly supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and elsewhere. The Brotherhood, of course, has been completely ousted from power. It came to power in Egypt, but it was ousted quite quickly by General Sisi. The assumption with Egypt was that while Egypt in the among Arab majority countries does not invent all the trends, if it adopts a trend, it can make it hegemonic because Egyptians dominate the center of gravity of the Arab world. So Erdogan believed that if there was a Turkey-aligned political movement in power in Cairo, the Brotherhood, that would amplify Turkey's power to other regional capitals. The opposite happened. Brotherhood was ousted from power. It was designated as domestic and regional security threat, not just only by Egypt, but also Egypt's allies, wealthy Gulf monarchies congregated in Gulf Cooperation Council, Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, Kuwaitis, and royal monarchies around the region in the Middle East also took issue with Turkey's support to the Brotherhood from Morocco to Jordan. So Turkey lost nearly 10 Arab countries overnight. Then its involvement in Syria also put Turkey against Iran, its historic competitor in the Middle East, and Russia, Turkey's nemesis. So in the end, Turkey ended up having almost no friends by the time of the end of the last decade, with the exception of Qatar, which, like Turkey's, had a pro-Brotherhood foreign policy, and maybe Libya's half the Tripoli-based international government. That is what I think forced Erdogan to pivot, seeing the failure of this policy that was supposed to make Turkey a star power nation in the Middle East, which ended up with Turkey having no friends on all adversaries in the Middle East. Turkish-Israeli ties also ruptured in this period. He decided that a pivot was needed. So the third phase of Erdogan's foreign policy, after internationalism and a singular Middle East focus, the opposite of Ataturk's Europe focus, perhaps, the third phase is no singular focus anywhere. Neither Europe nor Middle East. Just sit where you are and deal with Europe and Middle East and Eurasia and Russia and US, and kind of have the world rotate around you instead of trying to rotate around other parts of the world.
That's really interesting. But maybe if we stay in the Middle East, what happened recently in Syria could be a boost to Turkish foreign ambitions in or Middle Eastern ambitions. Because the way I understand it, it now has a significant say in what's going to happen in the country, in Syria. Is that an accurate assessment, or what's your view?
Pretty much. So Turkey's involvement in Syria until recently didn't look like it was going anywhere. Turkey had supported rebels to out the Assad regime. Assad regime, thanks to backing from Russia and Iran, had survived. And of course, Turkey was also hosting millions of refugees from Syria. There's a very powerful anti-refugee, anti-immigrant movement in Turkey. This is where I think you can kind of look at Turkey and say, well, it does look like a European country. It's just replicating Europe's anti-immigrant, anti-refugee movements. And so Erdogan really wanted to make sure that some of these refugees would go back to Syria. There are about 4 million of them in Turkey, constituting a nearly 5% addition to country's population of 85 million people. Assad felt that he didn't have to negotiate with Turkey. He was winning. He ignored Ankara. I think that Turkey's reaction was the expression is, I guess in English, is if the mountain will not come to Muhammad, Muhammad will come to the mountain. Erdogan decided to go to Damascus. He said, well, if Assad is not coming to my position, I'm going to go take him out. And Turkish backed assault, including through HTS, was successful. In fact, extremely successful, that the regime fell in under 2 weeks. Obviously, I think sanctions against Assad regime have crippled the regime, but also the fact that Israel had destroyed Hezbollah infrastructure meant that there was no more Hezbollah support to the regime, which is significant. And Russian Air Force and other troops are tied in Ukraine. So that's another area of weakened support. So Turkey took advantage of Ukraine war and Gaza war and Lebanon and Israel related dynamics to take and the weakening of Assad regime, and the regime was out. So now here in the United States, we have a new administration coming in, Trump administration. I think Erdogan has simplified Syria map for Trump, because it used to be this kind of Swiss cheese of 20 different political regions. Now it's 2 regions, Syria. If the Euphrates River goes through this country, Western Syria is under Turkish influence through the HTS. Eastern Syria is under U.S. influence through this group called Syrian Democratic Forces, with which the U.S. has allied to fight Islamic State for about a decade. I guess Turkey's game is to stitch Syria back together. Ankara has decided that instability across its southern borders is not a good thing, because it results in non-state actors, which then, of course, result in threats against Turkey. So Turkey wants to see the re-centralization of the Syrian state to its south, and for that, I think Erdogan will offer Trump a grand bargain at their first meeting. The bargain will be that Turkey will moderate and transform HTS, transforming meaning have HTS become inclusive, bring in other Syrian groups on board, have HTS get rid of foreign fighters and terrorists. In return, Trump would have to transform SDF, which would have to include other Kurdish groups, and also expel foreign fighters and terrorists in its ranks, including those affiliated with Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, which is a terror-designated entity by Turkey and the United States and NATO countries. So perhaps we are closer to Syria's re-centralization. A lot of things could still go wrong, Dominique. Another round of civil war. If the HTS government doesn't become inclusive enough, some groups could feel alienated and could resent. That could turn into political conflict. Or if HTS is not allowed to restore services and rebuild infrastructure quickly, people who have given the party a carte blanche now will say, well, we're not happy with you. And opposition to HTS, of course, will come not from the left, but from its right, or radical jihadi elements. So I'm not saying everything is wonderful in Syria, but if the transition goes forward, it looks like it is an informal Turkish-American condominium, with Turkey having influence in the West and U.S. in the East. And it will be up to Trump and Erdogan to stitch these 2 pieces of the condominium together back into re-centralizing Syria.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. And do you think that Turkey has so much influence over HTS today that if it tells HTS to do something, for example, like to be inclusive and to be relatively liberal, HTS basically has to listen or will listen?
So HTS is not subservient to Turkey. It's got its own agenda. And but it's grateful to Turkey, because Turkey, probably helped and backed this group in its assault against the Assad regime. Also, the HTS is, designated as a terrorist entity, and so it wants a few things to happen. It wants to be delisted, undesignated. It wants to be recognized by everyone as Syria's government. It also wants international aid to flow in. If there's no international aid and construction money coming in, HTS will be unable to restore Syria's services. And I think that the carte blanche that the Syrian population has given to this party will expire. So they need Turkey going forward for at least another year or two, because Turkey is the vehicle that HTS has reached out to the West, EU, NATO members, for delisting, for recognition, and for international aid. But Turkey, there's a risk that Turkey can overplay its hand. I would call this a scenario of uncomfortable Ottomans in Damascus, semi-joking. What would it look like? The Ottoman pashas who ruled Syria until 20th century were not very popular. The Syrians remember young Turkish persecution of Arab nationalists. Ottoman legacy in the Middle East is quite similar to the Ottoman legacy in the Balkans in some countries, such as Greece and Serbia, where it's not viewed as quite favorable. So if Turkey kind of starts to come in and patronize the new Syrian leadership in HTS, that might backfire. So Ankara has to be careful in the way it reaches out to Syrian government. But I would say that the HTS is going to listen to Turkey's advice until it's delisted, until it gets recognition and aid, and that Turkey will have to be really careful not to look like it's patronizing Syria's new leaders, because that will never work out well for Turkey's interests.
And could you just briefly explain what does Turkey want in relation to the Kurds in Syria? Because obviously the Kurdish question for Turkey is really important, and there were speculations that the Kurdish minority in Syria might try to gain more independence, which I guess Turkey would try to prevent, or what's your take?
So there are a few pieces of the Kurdish puzzle, one of which is that Turkey is being quite successful in its effort to defeat the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK. The PKK has been fighting Turkey for decades. It started originally as a Marxist-Leninist movement in the Cold War, has since morphed into a nationalist movement. But the PKK has been fighting Turkey for decades, including through terror acts against civilians, bombing the public buses and other civilian targets. Turkey has almost completely defeated the PKK as a terror the threat of terrorism inside the country. But the PKK has some regional offshoots in the Middle East, one of which is in Syria, called People's Protection Forces, YPG. In 2014, the US government partnered with the YPG to fight ISIS, a very tactical partnership. At the time, the YPG folded itself under SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, of which the YPG is the core element. The US government has supported SDF to fight ISIS. ISIS has been defeated, but a fear is that it may come back. So the question, I guess, for the US administration is, finding a modus vivendi with Turkey, which is part of the ownership of this new informal condominium in Syria, and also at the same time, a new relationship with SDF. I think that what we're going to see is Turkey is pursuing right now a process to disarm the PKK. The PKK's founding leader, Abdullah Öcalan, was caught by Turkey and put in jail in 1999. Öcalan desperately wants to get out of jail, and there's some news stories suggesting that he may call the PKK to disarm and withdraw from Turkey completely. Öcalan would in return get house arrest, I guess. But if the PKK were to disarm and cease to be a threat, the PKK-YPG relationship at that point would not matter as much for Turkey because there's no more PKK. In other words, Turkey can come to terms to live with Syrian Kurds if at the same time, of course, the YPG SDF ejects PKK leadership and disavows its ties to the group. That's why in the earlier part I was suggesting that the US from Turkey is that Ankara should moderate HTS. That will include HTS expelling foreign fighters and getting rid of terrorists, including other Syrians, and maybe changing its name. I think Turkey wants from the US a similar transformation of the SDF and the YPG, that the group change its name, maybe, expel PKK members, and become inclusive to other Syrian Kurds. I think that you could get to a modus vivendi that looks like Turkish relationship with Iraq's Kurdish region, known as Kurdistan Regional Government. That government in the north of Iraq has excellent ties with Turkey. So when people say Turks and Kurds hate each other, I think that's quite simplistic. Turkey has excellent ties with Iraqi Kurds. The relationship has a lot of components of security, energy, and economic cooperation. I can see that form between Turkey and Syrian Kurds going forward. If that transformation of SDF happens, and also US and Turkey work together to stitch Syria's two parts back into one country again.
Finally, on the Middle East, I wanted to ask about Israel, because it seems that since October 7th, the Turkish Israeli relations got a lot worse. And especially recently, there was an Israeli governmental committee that recently claimed that Israel must prepare for war with Turkey. So, what are the reasons for the worsening of the relations between the two countries? And why did it get so much worse recently? And where is this talk of war coming from, and how realistic it is?
I have actually read a translation, Hebrew direct translation of the said report, and it doesn't really say there's going to be Turkish-Israeli war. It does say, however, that Israel is worried about Turkey's increased influence in the Levant, including through Islamist actors like HTS. So I think what we're seeing is that Turkey and Israel have kind of become indirect neighbors. Turkey has influence in Damascus. Israel is in the Golan Heights and has expanded its area of occupation into Syrian territory. It's only 20 kilometers away from Turkish forces. They're within shouting distance politically of each other. So, and the two countries kind of are hesitant or have kind of, I guess, calms towards each other's regional ambitions. They haven't been getting along quite well. But I don't think that this will result in conflict. I think that what we need is kind of someone playing interactive role in bringing Israeli and Turkish elites together. This will be President Trump, who has excellent ties with both Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. I guess Trump could tell them, please don't get into conflict. I'm busy. Trump is going to be busy with China. It looks like that's his agenda. So where does this leave us? You could also have Jordan's king play a role. The king can talk to Turks and Israelis alike. And I think the Israelis should actually be happy, not unhappy about the change of events in Syria. Iran has been completely expelled. This is quite significant. Iran's influence going back to the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. It's almost, when you think about 1980, 2024, nearly a 5-decade involvement. That's gone. That's very significant. Iran wants to destroy Israel. Turkey doesn't like Israel. These two things are very different. Ideally, Turkey and Israel should get along, but I think what Turkey is there is it opposes some of Israel's policies. It doesn't want to destroy it or annihilate it. So Israelis perhaps should take some comfort in the fact that Iran is no more their neighbor, though that neighbor is now perhaps indirectly Turkey. I think that we're going to have to see some kind of Turkish-Israeli detente on regional issues and avoiding escalation. And the detente could be produced, in my view, by President Trump here in the United States.
So let's move from the Middle East to the other dimension of Turkish foreign policy, to closer to Europe and to the West. And you've mentioned Turkey's membership in NATO, and that was one of the things that I've always been kind of confused about, because Turkey seems, and you've sort of described it, it seems to want to be unaligned and its own independent power. But at the same time, it's part of an alliance that clearly makes it aligned with one side. And even on Russia, in theory, it's part of the NATO bloc. But at the same time, Turkey doesn't seem to see itself in that way. So how should we see Turkish membership in NATO, and why is Turkey even actually in NATO alliance? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.